Well, custodians of heritage statues have been told to stand up to those seeking to erase history under new guidance from the Culture Secretary. This includes advice to explain the significance of certain statues. It's been issued in response to growing pressure in recent years to take down memorials which have links with the slave trade. It comes also as a crisis-hit Scottish NHS board has announced it will begin a programme of reparations for its historical links to slavery, despite, of course, an acute lack of resources to actually treat patients. Well, joining me now is social commentator Dr. Rakib Ehsan. Good afternoon to you, Rakib.
Afternoon, Julia. How are you?
Thanks for joining. I'm very well indeed, but I mean, just amazed. Well, I don't know why I'm amazed anymore at these stories. They come up every few months now, don't they? Let's start with a story about the statues, though. I mean, I'm encouraged, and I'm sure you are, that the Culture Secretary, at least Frazer, is actually talking about, protecting statues. But it is still an extraordinary state of affairs that anyone needs to say this, and that we don't just throw every statue that might offend anyone who once walked past it or might one day walk past it and throw it in the river like they did in Bristol.
Absolutely. And I'd make the point that historical figures, like many of us as individuals, are complicated. And I think that there are times that you look at historical figures and the things that they've done may well even be contradictory. I think that in terms of what we've seen in recent times with the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, the discussion about people forcibly removing statues even without any kind of local democratic consultation, I think that we had to address that. But I think also that there's a great deal of infantilization, that individuals are unable to come to their own independent judgment about historical figures. But I think more widely, Julia, I think that in recent times we haven't shown enough pride in our own history and heritage, and especially the contributions that we made to humankind, whether it's sort of scientific advancement, technological progress, the Industrial Revolution. I think that we have a great deal to be proud of, and I just haven't seen much of that. And I think, to be honest, I haven't seen much of that from the Conservative government in recent times.
No, indeed. And it is interesting. You mentioned, local consultation, and we know we've been showing pictures here of the statue of Colston, who basically, was responsible for a huge amount of the wealth that Bristol had, and that statue, of course, being defaced and dragged through the streets. As, by the way, police just stood by and dragged and thrown into the dock there. And it's now been put into a museum, complete with all the paint on it. But the interesting thing is that for quite some time, people who wanted to remove that statue had been, having, local voting and trying to get that through. And they didn't have the public support, which is why it hadn't happened.
Well, absolutely. And the reality is, if there's not the public support, then the statue has to remain. Julia, we live in a liberal democracy, and procedures and processes of a clearly democratic nature have to be respected. And I'd make the point, I did research myself back in 2021 when you had that rise of the BLM movement. We'd seen that in the summer of 2020. Around 1 in 6 Black British people saw removing statues as a legitimate form of protest. So it was a minority view within the Black British population. So I think that a lot of these activists, which are unruly, they don't like sticking to the rules. They're not representative of the very people that they supposedly seek to represent.
No, exactly. But my thing is, yes, you might not like that statue, but that statue is from the past, erected in the past at a time when our values were very different. The whole point is that we now do think differently, and therefore we aren't in any way going, oh, he's a wonderful guy and he made money from the slave trade. I mean, I don't think we'll come across anyone who thinks that that's good or something to celebrate. But the point was that statue was erected at a different time, and we would erect statues of a different kind now to different people for different reasons. That's what's called progress. When we erase our history, when we attempt to say that never happened, we make it, I think, even harder to show progress, don't we? It's almost like pretending that we're starting at year zero, and this isn't good enough now, as opposed to saying, wow, our country is so much better than it was, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. And as Rishi Sunak said in his speech to the Tory party conference, the fact that it's not just that he's the first Asian Prime Minister of this country, it's the fact that it wasn't a big deal. It was. No. I mean, the editorialists in some of the newspapers seemed to think it was a big deal. No one else cared.
No, absolutely. And I think you make such a good point, Julia, that to hold these historical figures to our current day moral cultural standards is actually quite immature. And I think in some ways, the statues can even act as a reminder of the significant social progress that we've made in a variety of areas, whether it comes to racial equality being one example. So I think that we need to move away from this kind of infantilization of people, that they're not able to form their own independent judgment, and actually understand that historical figures, they may have done some very bad things, but they might have also done some good things.
Yeah.
But the key thing is holding them to our current moral standards, in my view,
Yes.
is not necessarily a mature way to approach
well,
history.
given that most of us can't keep up with the moral standards of now, even 10 years ago, I mean, God, Barack Obama, oh, he'd be on a plinth for most people, wouldn't he? Well, you know, he was opposed to same-sex marriage. I mean, you know, he doesn't stand up to scrutiny. If he doesn't, I don't know who does. But this is the fascinating thing, is how quickly these things are changing and how much people are desperate to just throw away our past. Apart from when they are desperate to bring up our past constantly, in like colonialism and slavery. And coming back to this story about this health board in the NHS in Scotland, NHS Lothian, it's one of the largest health boards in the country, and they are launching a programme of reparations. I mean, it's laughable, to atone for the links to slavery in the 18th century. They did a report and found out that the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh had profited by almost £40 million from slavery in today's money because of the ownership of a Caribbean slave plantation by a doctor who gave a load of money to the hospital. They're now saying, well, we need to make atone for that. So they're going to pay for some artwork, and they're going to sort of try and improve healthcare sign a pledge to improve healthcare in Jamaica. They're not looking at paying 40 million quid in reparations, because that would be, by the way, taxpayers' money. But the idea that a single penny of scarce NHS resources in any part of the United Kingdom should be spent on sort of, you know, basically sort of slapping yourself with a birch and wearing a hair shirt, you know, to atone for the sins of people long, long dead, seems absurd to me. What do you make of it, Rakib?
I think it's beyond absurd, and to my understanding, this particular NHS board in Scotland is suffering considerable financial difficulties, and this is at a time when public satisfaction in the NHS is extremely low. We have an astronomical NHS backlog, so it's incredible to me that resources would be used in such a way. Now, Julia, I support us having an official international development budget, which helps other countries to develop robust healthcare infrastructures. I support that, but the idea that resources within the NHS would be used in such a way, this is ultimately, in my view, I suspect this is some people prioritising their own white guilt over patient well-being. And totally. I find that to be disgraceful, if I'm being
absolutely. I mean, it's all about the white people thing, and that's the thing I find fascinating, is this idea that, well, I'm white, so I'm British, so I must take responsibility. I feel not a scintilla of guilt for those horrific crimes against humanity, which they were, because I'm pretty darn sure that my family were either working in mills or working in the fields, earning a pittance, just scraping ends together, maybe probably not eating at weekends because there wasn't any money left. And the idea that I, like most other people in this country, the idea that I've got any responsibility or have benefited from the profits of slavery is an absolute nonsense. So why on earth should I feel guilty about it? Surely we should be celebrating and constantly telling people that we are the only country, the only empire ever to basically abolish slavery.
No, and I'll also make the point that back in the day, some of the strongest anti-slavery attitudes, you'd find that in working class parts of the country. So, for example, in Manchester, you had workers there refusing to work with slave-picked cotton. So if you really saw where the strongest forms of opposition were, it was in our working class communities, white British working class communities. Now, more generally, I've always made the point that for all our flaws, we're a relatively successful multiracial democracy. But we're also a democracy where we have a healthcare system which is struggling. Yeah. And in my view, we need to be very careful and very efficient with our resources to ensure that we provide the best patient care, irrespective of racial identity, religious affiliation, or ethnic heritage.
And don't order artwork to flagellate yourself because it makes you feel better because you work in HR in a hospital.